In the heart of a bustling city stood an orphanage where secrets lingered in every shadow. Among its residents was Ojugo, a blind girl whose presence stirred both mystery and unease among those around her. The matron, who had witnessed countless children come and go, knew there was something different about this one, though she buried this knowledge beneath layers of deliberate cruelty, masking her own guilty conscience. 12 years had passed since the morning when the staff found the infant wrapped in a thin blanket on their doorstep. None could have predicted how this blind child would come to challenge everything they thought they knew about the natural order of things. For there was something extraordinary about Ojugo that defied explanation. Whenever tears fell from her sightless eyes, the neighborhood dogs would gather at the orphanage gates, their urgent barking echoing through the corridors like a chorus of protectors. The other children whispered among themselves, their young minds spinning tales of witchcraft and curses. They didn't know that their fears were born of ignorance, just as they couldn't see how their whispers made Ojugo's heart constrict with loneliness. The matron, who should have dispelled such rumors, instead fed them with her sharp words and cold demeanor, all while carrying the weight of her own dark deeds. One particular incident remained fresh in everyone's memory. A couple, childless for 30 years, had finally chosen Ojugo. Hope had bloomed in the girl's heart that day, fragile as spring's first flower. But as their car approached the orphanage gates, a pack of dogs materialized as if summoned by an unseen force. They surrounded the vehicle, their bodies forming an impenetrable barrier, their howls rising in an otherworldly crescendo. The couple, their faces drained of color, had hurriedly returned Ojugo to the orphanage, crossing themselves as they fled. What no one knew, not the frightened couple, not the whispering children, not even Ojugo herself, was that among those dogs was one who watched with more than animal intelligence. This dog's eyes held a mother's anguish, a curse's burden, and a secret that would one day shatter the very foundations of lives built on deception. In her tiny room, Ojugo would often sit alone, her fingers tracing patterns on the windowsill as she listened to the dogs barking outside. While others heard chaos in their cries, she found comfort in their presence, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps some part of her soul recognized what her conscious mind could not, that love sometimes wore strange disguises, and that destiny had a way of revealing its plans in the most unexpected ways. The matron, watching from her office window, would see the dogs gathering and feel the cold finger of guilt trace down her spine. She knew why they came. Oh, how she knew. But pride and fear kept her silent. Instead, she masked her discomfort with sharp words. "Why can't you be normal for once, Ojugo?" She would snap, each harsh syllable a brick in the wall of her own denial. Little did anyone suspect that this blind girl, whom they treated as an outcast, was actually the rightful heir to one of the city's greatest fortunes. The truth lay buried beneath years of deceit, waiting for the right moment to emerge, just as a seed waits beneath winter frost for spring's awakening. And like all buried truths, this one would eventually find its way to the light, though its revelation would shake the foundations of many lives, starting with those who thought themselves most secure in their positions of power and privilege. Life at the orphanage had settled into a rhythm of isolation for Ojugo, each day marking itself with a steady drumbeat of rejection and whispered fears. The other children, their footsteps quick and light, would scatter at her approach like leaves before an autumn wind. They didn't realize that their fear was merely a reflection of their own ignorance, a mirror showing not Ojugo's darkness, but their own. In the quiet hours of the evening, when shadows lengthened and the day's harsh voices faded, Ojugo would find her solace in song. Her voice, pure and haunting, would drift through the orphanage's corridors like a spirit seeking rest. Those who heard it felt their hearts catch in their throats, moved by emotions they couldn't quite name. Even the most hardened staff members would pause in their tasks, their eyes growing distant with unexpected tears. Yet none dared approach the source of such beauty, their superstition stronger than their sympathy. The matron, listening from her office, would grip her pen tighter with each note. Every melody that floated through her window was a reminder of her betrayal, of the curse she had set in motion so many years ago. She didn't know that her own punishment was drawing nearer with each passing day, that her sight would one day be traded for the truth she had helped to hide. A disappointment to the orphanage, she would say loudly, her words sharp enough to cut through Ojugo's songs. Nothing but a nuisance. But beneath her cruel proclamations lay a growing fear, for she alone knew the true power of the curse she had helped create, and she alone could feel its bonds beginning to weaken. On rainy days, when the weather matched the mood within the orphanage's walls, Ojugo would retreat to her tiny bedroom. It was there, in the space barely large enough for a bed and a small chest of drawers, that she would pour out her heart in melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Even the rain would seem to pause in its descent, as if nature itself bent to listen to the blind girl's lament. The dogs, ever-present guardians at the gates, would howl in harmony with her songs. Among them, one particular dog, who was so much more than she appeared, would press closer to the gates, her canine heart breaking anew at her daughter's sorrow. Adobe, trapped in her cursed form, could only watch and wait, her human consciousness screaming in silent agony behind animal eyes. The threat of expulsion hung over Ojugo like a storm cloud ready to break. "If no one adopts you by next month," the matron had declared, her voice carrying the weight of false authority, "we'll have no choice but to send you away." What the matron didn't realize was that her words, meant to instill fear, were actually setting in motion events that would lead to her own undoing. Other children in the orphanage, watching this drama unfold, felt conflicting emotions they couldn't quite understand. Some, in the quiet of their own hearts, felt pity for the blind girl with the beautiful voice. Others, caught up in the contagion of fear, convinced themselves that their cruelty was justified. None of them could see the invisible threads of fate that were slowly drawing together, weaving a tapestry of justice that would soon be revealed. In her darker moments, Ojugo would press her hands against the cool glass of her window, feeling the vibrations of the dog's barks through the pane. She didn't know that she was touching the barrier between her present and her future, between the lies that surrounded her and the truth that was fighting to emerge. Her fingers would trace patterns on the glass, unconsciously drawing shapes that mirrored the destiny waiting to unfold. The orphanage itself seemed to hold its breath, its old walls containing not just the stories of its current residents, but the weight of secrets soon to be revealed. Every creak of its floorboards, every whisper of wind through its corridors, seemed to be counting down to the moment when everything would change, when a blind girl's song would attract the attention of those who would unwittingly set her on the path to her true inheritance. The day the Obodos arrived at the orphanage dawned bright and full of promise, though none could have predicted how this single visit would unravel years of carefully woven deception. Mr. and Mrs. Obodo stepped from their luxury car, their wealthy status evident in every detail of their appearance, from their perfectly tailored clothes to their confident bearing. They were known throughout the city for their generosity, though this reputation, like so much else about them, was built on a foundation they had stolen from another. The matron, her face arranged in a careful mask of welcome, bustled about directing the staff to present the orphanage's best face. In her nervous energy, she didn't notice how her own shadow seemed to darken and twist against the walls, as if nature itself was marking her for the revelation to come. She had arranged the children with tactical precision, the brightest, most charming ones positioned prominently, while Ojugo was banished to her room with stern instructions to remain silent. "Stay out of sight," the matron had hissed, her words carrying the weight of years of guilty secrets. "We can't risk anything strange happening today." What she didn't know was that her very efforts to hide Ojugo would lead to the girl's discovery. For destiny has a way of finding its own path, like water flowing around obstacles to reach its destination. Mrs. Obodo, known as Ada, moved through the celebration with graceful authority, her keen eyes taking in every detail. There was something almost regal in her bearing, an inheritance of manner that unknowingly mimicked the true owner of her wealth. She didn't realize that every step she took through these halls brought her closer to a truth that would shatter her carefully constructed world. The celebration was in full swing, with children performing rehearsed songs and dances, when the first notes of Ojugo's voice drifted down from above. It was a melody unlike anything the gathered crowd had ever heard, pure, haunting, and filled with an emotion so raw it seemed to touch something primitive and true in every heart that heard it. The sound floated through the orphanage like a spirit seeking justice, wrapping itself around the hearts of all who heard it. Mr. Obodo froze mid-conversation, his face transformed by wonder. "What is that sound?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Beside him, Ada tilted her head, her eyes growing wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Neither of them knew that they were hearing not just a song, but the voice of their own redemption, or their undoing, depending on the choices they would make in the moments to come. The matron's face drained of color as she scrambled to distract them, her words tumbling out in nervous haste. "Oh, that's just one of our older children," she said quickly, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "She's blind, you see, and tends to stay out of the way." But her attempts at deflection only served to pique the Oboto's curiosity further, drawing them inexorably toward the source of the music. As they climbed the stairs, following the ethereal sound, the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. The dogs outside, including the one who was so much more than a dog, grew still and watchful. Adobe, in her cursed form, felt a stirring of hope she hadn't dared to entertain in years. Could these people, unknowingly living in her father's house, be the key to breaking the curse that bound both mother and daughter? They found Ojugo in her tiny room, her face tilted slightly upward as she sang, unaware of the audience she had attracted. The sight of her, small, vulnerable, yet radiating an inner strength, struck something deep within Ada's heart. Neither she nor her husband could have explained the powerful pull they felt toward this child, not knowing that they were being drawn into a story much older and more complex than they could imagine. The matron hovered anxiously in the doorway, her protests growing weaker as she watched the wealthy couple fall under Ojugo's spell. She could see her carefully maintained world beginning to crack, but was powerless to stop it. In that moment, as Mr. Oboto knelt before the blind girl and gently asked her name, the wheels of fate began to turn more quickly, setting in motion events that would eventually expose every buried truth and lost inheritance. The Oboto mansion rose before them like a dream materialized in stone and glass, its grandeur a testament to generations of wealth, though not their own. As their car wound up the curved driveway, Ojugo sat in the back seat, her heart drumming an anxious rhythm against her ribs. Though she couldn't see the mansion's imposing facade, she could feel its presence in the way sounds changed, in the subtle shift of air currents around her, and in the reverent hush that fell over her new parents' voices. What none of them knew, in that moment of arrival, was that Ojugo was coming home in the truest sense, returning to the very house that should have been her birthright. The grand entrance hall, with its polished marble floors and soaring ceilings, had been built by her grandfather's dreams and her mother's inheritance, though these truths lay buried beneath years of careful deception. Mrs. Oboto, her hand gentle on Ojugo's shoulder, guided her through the house with the pride of someone showing off their most precious possessions. "This will be your new home," she said warmly, unaware of the irony in her words. She couldn't have known that every step they took echoed with the footsteps of those who had walked these halls before, including Adobe, Ojugo's mother, who had once moved through these same spaces with the confidence of true ownership. The introduction of Yu, Ojugo's personal maid, marked a bright spot in the transition. Yu's heart, untainted by greed or deception, recognized something special in the blind girl immediately. She approached her duties not as mere obligation, but with genuine warmth that would prove to be more significant than anyone could have predicted. In the grand tapestry of fate being woven, Yu's pure love would become the thread that could break ancient curses. But darkness lurked in the corners of the seeming fairy tale. Amara, the Oboto's 18-year-old daughter, watched from the top of the grand staircase, her face twisted in an expression that would have shocked her parents had they seen it. In her mind, the mansion's spacious halls suddenly felt crowded, and her position as the family's precious only child seemed threatened by this blind interloper who had somehow enchanted her parents. In him, Amara's best friend and constant shadow, proved to be the match that would light this powder keg of resentment. She stood beside Amara, her whispered words dropping like poison into fertile soil. Why would your parents adopt a blind girl? And give her a personal maid, no less? Her voice dripped with calculated concern, each word carefully chosen to stoke the flames of Amara's insecurity. Are they tired of you? Do they think you're not good enough anymore? From her position on the stairs, Amara could see how her parents fussed over Ojugo, how they guided her with gentle hands and spoke in soft, encouraging tones. Each gesture of kindness toward the new arrival felt like a personal betrayal to Amara. who had never had to share her parents' affection before. She couldn't see the bigger picture, that the very wealth and privilege she feared losing had never rightfully been hers to begin with. Outside, faithful as ever, the dogs gathered at the mansion's gates, though they were shooed away by the security guards who didn't understand their significance. Among them, Adobe watched her daughter disappear into what had once been her own home, her canine heart torn between joy at seeing Ojugo in her rightful place and anguish at not being able to reveal herself. The curse that bound her still held firm, waiting for the moment when true love would finally break its power. In her new bedroom, Ojugo ran her fingers over fine linens and smooth surfaces, trying to map out this unfamiliar world. Her throat tight with emotion, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not knowing that her presence in this house was not chance, but destiny beginning to right an ancient wrong. The very walls seemed to recognize her, though she couldn't know this, couldn't feel how the house itself seemed to exhale, as if welcoming home a long-lost child. As night fell over the mansion, different dreams filled its many rooms. Ojugo dreamt of belonging, while Amara plotted in her anger. The Obodos celebrated their generous act of adoption, unaware that their comfortable world was built on shifting sands. And somewhere in the darkness outside, a mother in a dog's body kept vigil, waiting for the date when all these tangled threads of fate would finally unravel to reveal the truth. Darkness has a way of growing slowly, like shadows lengthening across a room, and so it was with Amara's campaign against Ojugo. What began as petty jealousy festered into something far more malicious, each successful act of cruelty emboldening her to attempt worse. The grand mansion, once a symbol of hope for Ojugo, became a maze of hidden dangers, with every corner potentially concealing another of Amara's traps. The first attack came on an ordinary afternoon, when Amara deliberately spilled oil in Ojugo's path. She stood in the shadows, her heart racing not with fear, but with anticipation, as Ojugo's feet hit the slick surface. The blind girl's fall seemed to happen in slow motion, her body crumpling against the hard floor with a sound that echoed through the hallway. While Yu rushed to help, Amara savored her victory, unaware that each act of cruelty was another step toward her own downfall. Outside, Adobe witnessed her daughter's pain through the mansion's windows, her canine form trembling with suppressed rage and helplessness. The curse that bound her seemed to tighten its grip in these moments, forcing her to remain a mere observer to her child's suffering. The other dogs around her sensed her distress, their collective whining a chorus of sympathy that went unnoticed by the mansion's human occupants. But Amara's appetite for causing pain only grew. With Inim's encouragement, each whispered suggestion more poisonous than the last, she graduated from physical attacks to more insidious forms of harm. The laxatives she slipped into Ojugo's food represented a new level of calculated cruelty. As Ojugo spent hours in misery, her body racked with pain, Amara stood outside the bathroom door, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She couldn't have known that each act of malice was being recorded in the ledger of fate, waiting to be balanced. Yu, watching Ojugo's suffering with growing concern, began to suspect the truth, but in the complex hierarchy of the household, her position left her powerless to accuse the daughter of her employers. She could only try to be more vigilant, her heart breaking each time she failed to prevent another of Amara's attacks. What she didn't realize was that her genuine love for Ojugo was slowly building the power needed to break an ancient curse. The Obados remained blissfully unaware of their daughter's cruelty, choosing to see only what they wanted to see. Mr. Obado, his conscience occasionally pricked by memories of how he had acquired his wealth, found it easier to focus on his charitable act of adoption than to look too closely at the dynamics within his household. Mrs. Obodo, meanwhile, interpreted Ojugo's increasing withdrawal as simple shyness, never suspecting the terror that now colored her adopted daughter's every waking moment. But it was Amara's final act of cruelty that would shatter this carefully maintained facade of domestic harmony. On a night when shadows seemed to gather more thickly than usual in the mansion's corners, she set her most devastating plan in motion. The knife she used to cut her own arm felt cold against her skin, each drop of blood part of a performance designed to destroy Ojugo's new life completely. As she planted the bloodied knife under Ojugo's pillow, Amara felt powerful, in control, unaware that she was merely a pawn in a larger game of fate. The universe, it seemed, had a way of using even the darkest actions to bring about necessary change. In her room, Ojugo slept peacefully, unaware of the storm about to break over her head. The dogs outside the mansion grew restless that night, their howls carrying a note of warning that no one heeded. Adobe, sensing the approaching crisis, paced anxiously at the gates. The curse that bound her seemed to pulse with new energy, as if responding to the proximity of its own unraveling. Everything was building toward a moment of truth that would change not just Ojugo's life, but the lives of everyone in the mansion. When Almura's screams finally pierced the night, they carried more truth than she knew, not in their false accusations, but in the way they signaled the beginning of the end for all the lies that had sustained the Obodo family's position. The knife under Ojugo's pillow would prove to be not just a weapon meant to harm, but the key that would ultimately unlock a door to justice long delayed. Dawn broke over the city with the color of old bruises as Yu and Ojugo stood before the orphanage's iron gates. The morning air carried the weight of rejection, but also something else, attention, like the moment before lightning strikes. The matron's refusal to readmit Ojugo hung in the air between them. There's no room for her here. Another child has taken her place. The words were cruel, but they were also the last pieces of a puzzle falling into place, though none present could see the pattern yet. Yu stood straight back before the closed gates, her ordinary maid's uniform somehow transformed into armor by the strength of her conviction. In that moment, she made a decision that would unknowingly break an ancient curse. "You have me, Ojugo," she said, her voice carrying the weight of true love, not the romantic kind that fills storybooks, but the pure, selfless love that moves mountains and breaks chains. "My home may not be grand like the Obodo mansion, but it's warm, and you will always be safe there." Outside the gates, the dogs began to gather, moving with purpose rather than their usual restless energy. Adobe, still trapped in her canine form, felt something shifting in the curse that bound her. Each beat of her heart seemed to pulse with possibility, the magic that had held her captive for so long beginning to crack like ice in spring. Ojugo swayed suddenly, her consciousness slipping away as if pulled by an invisible tide. As she fell, the world around her seemed to pause. Leaves hung suspended in the air, birds froze mid-flight, and even the sun's rays appeared to hold their breath. Yu's cry of alarm cut through this moment of stillness, but before she could reach Ojugo, the dogs had formed a circle around the unconscious girl. What happened next would later be described differently by everyone who witnessed it. The dogs approached Ojugo, their movements synchronized as if choreographed by an unseen hand. One dog, Adobe, stepped forward from the pack, her form seeming to shimmer in the morning light. As she gently licked her daughter's face, the curse's power finally shattered. The magic that broke in that moment was visible only to those it directly affected, but its effects rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. In the orphanage, the matron suddenly cried out, her hands flying to her eyes as darkness descended upon them, the price of her long-ago betrayal finally coming due. In the Obodo mansion, mirrors cracked without explanation, as if the weight of lies they had reflected had finally become too heavy to bear. Ojugo's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in her life, she saw the world around her. Colors, shapes, and movements flooded her consciousness. The blue of the sky, the green of the leaves, the concerned face of Yu bending over her. But most importantly, she saw the dogs dispersing, and among them, one figure beginning to change, its form shifting and growing until it became someone else entirely. The orphanage staff, drawn by the commotion, watched from windows and doorways as reality itself seemed to bend and reshape itself in their courtyard. They could not yet know that they were witnessing the unraveling of not just one curse, but an entire tapestry of deception that had been woven through their lives for years. Yu, her arms still protectively around Ojugo, felt rather than saw the change coming over her young charge. The air around them crackled with invisible energy, and in that moment, she understood that her simple act of love, offering a home when all others had turned away, had set in motion events that would reshape not just Ojugo's future, but the lives of everyone connected to her story. As the morning light strengthened, it illuminated a scene transformed. Where there had been despair, now stood hope. Where there had been darkness, now shone light. And where there had been a lost, blind girl, now stood someone who could finally see not just the world around her, but the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The dogs dispersed slowly, their mission accomplished, leaving behind a changed world and a story that was far from over. The matron's scream echoed through the orphanage halls like a banshee's wail, drawing everyone to her office where she sat clutching her face, her eyes now as blind as Ojugo's had once been. Poetic justice, some might call it, though justice rarely announces itself so dramatically. Her darkness was not just physical, it was the manifestation of years of guilt finally demanding its due. Inside her office, the weight of unspoken truths pressed down like a physical presence. The matron's hands trembled as she began to speak, each word drawn from her like poison from a wound. "I am responsible," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as confession poured forth. "I am responsible for everything that happened to you, Ojugo, and to your mother, Adobe." The name hung in the air like smoke, and in that moment, the tall, elegant woman who had been a dog mere minutes ago stepped forward. Adobe's transformation back to human form was complete, though her eyes held shadows of the animal she had been forced to become. Years of watching her daughter suffer while trapped in a dog's body had left marks that no magic could erase. "My closest friend," the matron continued, her sightless eyes turning toward where she sensed Adobe standing. "Adobe trusted me with everything, her secrets, her fears, her joy when she discovered she was pregnant." Her voice cracked on the last word, remembering the moment when jealousy had first taken root in her heart. "When your father rejected her, Adobe came to me for help. But I betrayed her." Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows through the windows, as if nature itself was providing punctuation to the matron's dark tale. The story of her visit to the herbalist unfolded like a nightmare. The curse she had commissioned, designed to strip Adobe of everything that made her special. "I wanted to ruin her life," the matron admitted, each word heavy with shame. "The curse transformed her into a dog, condemned to wander the earth, unable to reveal herself to those she loved." Adobe stood silent, her human face wet with tears as she remembered the years of watching her daughter grow up, able to protect her only through a dog's limited means. The curse had been cruelly elegant in its design. Only true love shown by a stranger to her daughter could break its power. The matron had ensured this would be nearly impossible by making Ojugo blind and spreading rumors of her being possessed. Yu, still holding Ojugo's hand, felt the pieces clicking into place. Her simple act of offering a home and love when everyone else had turned away had been the key to breaking the curse. She had done what no one else would, loved Ojugo purely, without condition or expectation. "I used your friend in him," the matron continued, turning her face toward where she thought Amara might be standing, though the girl had fled at the first sign of truth being revealed. "I manipulated her to poison your heart against Ojugo, fearing that if she found love in your family, the curse would break." The confession hung in the air like heavy smoke, suffocating in its completeness. Yet with each revealed truth, the atmosphere in the room seemed to lighten, as if the weight of lies was finally lifting. Adobe moved to stand beside her daughter, their shapes casting a single shadow on the floor, mother and child reunited after 12 years of enforced separation. But there was more to come. The matron's voice grew stronger as she revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the truth about Ojugo's inheritance. "Your mother, Adobe, was the only daughter of Chief Diaper, one of the wealthiest men in the city. When he died, he left everything to her." Her words caused a ripple of shock through the room. "The mansion where the Obodos live. It was meant to be yours, Ojugo. Your inheritance. Your birthright." The magnitude of this revelation settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Every memory of the grand mansion where Ojugo had briefly lived took on new meaning. She had been walking the halls of her own home, sleeping under her own roof, though she hadn't known it. The cruel irony of her situation with the Obodos became clear. They had adopted the very person from whom they had stolen everything. The morning light streamed through the windows, touching each face in the room. The blind matron with her heavy guilt, Adobe with her newly restored humanity, Ojugo with her newfound sight and knowledge of her true identity, and Yu with her simple, powerful love that had broken an ancient curse. Each of them had been transformed by the truth, though not all transformations were visible to the eye. Outside, the last of the dogs dispersed, their mission complete. The orphanage grounds felt different now, as if the very air had been cleansed of old secrets. But this was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see justice fully served and balance restored to lives long disturbed by lies and curses. The grand gates of the Obodo mansion opened before Adobe, Ojugo, and Yuyu like the pages of a story reaching its climax. The morning sun caught the wrought iron bars, casting shadows that seemed to point the way forward like accusing fingers. This time, Ojugo approached her grandfather's house with new eyes, both literally and figuratively, seeing for the first time the architectural details that spoke of Chief Diaper's vision and taste. Mr. Obodo himself emerged from the front door, his usual confident stride faltering as he recognized Adobe. The color drained from his face as if he had seen a ghost, which, in a way, he had. Adobe, he stammered, her name falling from his lips like a confession. You're alive. The words carried the weight of years of guilty knowledge, of wealth built on the foundation of someone else's absence. Behind him, Mrs. Obodo appeared, her hand flying to her throat as she took in the scene before her. The elegant woman standing beside Ojugo was unmistakably the same Adobe they had once known, the true heir to everything they now claimed as their own. In that moment, all their carefully constructed justifications began to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Amara, drawn by the commotion, emerged from the house only to freeze on the top step. "What's that witch doing here?" she demanded, pointing at Ojugo, her voice carrying the last vestiges of her former power. But her words died in her throat as her father turned to her, his face etched with a severity she had never seen before. "Silence, Amara," Mr. Obodo commanded, his voice heavy with the weight of approaching confession. "The girl you call a witch is the rightful owner of everything we have ever enjoyed." Each word seemed to age him, as if the truth was extracting its own price for being hidden so long. "All these houses, cars, the money you've taken for granted, they belong to Ojugo and her mother Adobe." The revelation hit Amara like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, her mind racing to process this new reality. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of irony. The girl she had tormented was actually the true heir to the wealth she had thought was her birthright. Her face, once twisted with contempt, now showed the dawning horror of understanding. Mrs. Obodo stepped forward, her voice defensive but trembling. "We thought she was gone forever. What were we supposed to do? Let everything fall to ruin?" But her justification sounded hollow even to her own ears, merely the echoes of lies they had told themselves for years. Adobe's response cut through the air like a blade of truth. "You were supposed to honor the trust my father placed in you," she said, her voice carrying the strength of one who had endured unimaginable hardship and emerged stronger. "Instead, you built your fortune on betrayal and deception." The gravity of the situation crushed Amara like a physical weight. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally understood the full scope of her family's deception and her own cruelty. The girl she had tormented, whose life she had tried to destroy, had been sleeping under her own roof, living as a guest in what should have been her home. Mr. Obodo, his shoulders slumped in defeat, knew there was only one path forward. Without being asked, he began the process of relinquishing everything: the house keys, the property documents, all the symbols of wealth they had claimed as their own. Each item he handed over seemed to lift a weight from his conscience while adding to the burden of his shame. The Obodos departed their false paradise with little more than the clothes they wore and the weight of their guilt. They would relocate to a small house in a modest neighborhood, where Mr. Obodo would take up a humble position that barely covered their basic needs. It was a dramatic fall from grace, but perhaps a necessary one, a chance for redemption through humility and honest work. As the gates closed behind the departing family, the mansion seemed to exhale, as if relieved to finally welcome its true owners home. Yu, who had watched the entire scene in respectful silence, found herself invited to stay, no longer as a maid, but as family. Her pure love, which had broken the curse, had earned her a permanent place in the restored household. Adobe and Ojugo stood in the entrance hall of their reclaimed home, their shadows merging on the marble floor like two pieces of a puzzle finally fitted together. The mansion, which had stood as a monument to deception for so many years, would now become a testament to justice restored and love triumphant. The dogs that had once gathered at its gates would no longer need to keep vigil. Their mission was complete, their protection no longer necessary. As the sun set on that transformative day, its rays painted the mansion's windows in shades of gold, as if nature itself was celebrating the restoration of rightful inheritance. The truth, so long buried under layers of deception, had finally found its way to the light, proving that justice, though sometimes slow, arrives with the certainty of dawn after the darkest night. The mansion that had once echoed with secrets now rang with genuine laughter. Adobe, Ojugo, and Yu settled into their shared life with the ease of puzzle pieces finding their proper places. The grand halls that had witnessed so much deception now bore witness to healing and joy, as three women bound not just by circumstance, but by genuine love created the family they had each longed for. Adobe wasted no time in setting plans in motion to restore her father's legacy. Chief Diaper had built his fortune not just on business acumen, but on genuine concern for his community, and his daughter was determined to honor that tradition. The mansion's gates, once symbols of exclusion, opened wide to welcome those in need, particularly children who, like Ojugo had once been, were searching for belonging. Yu, no longer bound by the constraints of servitude, blossomed in her new role as family member rather than servant. Her natural kindness, which had once been confined to the parameters of her position, now found full expression in helping Adobe manage their charitable initiatives. The love that had broken the curse continued to work its magic, touching lives far beyond their immediate circle. In the quiet evenings, Ojugo's voice still filled the mansion with song, but her melodies had changed. Where once there had been sorrow, now there was joy. Where there had been loneliness, now there was love. Her music drew people to the mansion, not out of curiosity about strange occurrences, but because of its pure beauty and the hope it inspired. The fates of those who had wronged them became object lessons in the workings of justice. The matron, permanently blind, spent her days in contemplation of her actions, her darkness becoming a path to inner light, as she dedicated herself to counseling others against the dangers of envy and betrayal. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered in corners of the city, though Adobe and Ojugo, in their mercy, ensured she was cared for despite her past cruelties. The Obodos, stripped of their stolen prosperity, faced the challenge of building a life based on truth rather than deception. Mr. Obodo's new position as a low-level clerk taught him humility, while Mrs. Obodo learned to find dignity in simplicity. Amara, perhaps changed the most by their reversal of fortune, began to understand the true meaning of worth beyond wealth and status. As for the dogs that had played such a crucial role in their story, they remained welcome visitors to the mansion grounds. Though Adobe no longer walked among them in canine form, they served as living reminders of the protection love can offer, even in its strangest manifestations. Their presence became a symbol of the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment of triumph and restoration. The story of Ojugo, the blind girl who became a beacon of hope, rippled through the city like waves in a pond, touching hearts and transforming lives far beyond the mansion's gates. In its telling and retelling, the tale carried deeper truths about the nature of love, justice, and redemption. First among these truths was the revelation that true value lies not in appearances or circumstances, but in the heart and spirit of a person. Ojugo's journey from rejected orphan to rightful heir demonstrated how superficial judgments often blind people to the treasure that lies within. Her blindness, once seen as a curse, had actually allowed her to develop the inner sight that truly mattered. The power of genuine love to transform lives emerged as another profound lesson. It was not the wealthy Obodo's conditional acceptance that broke the curse, but Yu's simple, unconditional love. This truth served as a reminder that the most powerful magic often comes not from grand gestures, but from sincere hearts willing to love without expectation of return. Justice, though slow in coming, proved to have its own wisdom and timing. The eventual exposure of truth demonstrated how no deception, however carefully maintained, can withstand the test of time. The Obodo's fall from stolen grace, and the matron's symbolic blindness showed that consequences, though delayed, arrive with the certainty of seasons changing. Perhaps most importantly, the story revealed how difference and adversity, often seen as curses, can become unexpected gifts. Ojugo's challenges had shaped her into someone capable of profound empathy and understanding. Her mother's curse, meant to destroy her, had instead given her the means to protect her daughter in ways no one could have foreseen. As the story spread, it became more than just a tale of curses broken and fortunes restored. It became a mirror in which people saw their own capacity for both cruelty and kindness, their own choice between love and fear, their own potential for transformation. The mansion on the hill stood as a testament not just to justice restored, but to the possibility of redemption that exists even in the darkest of circumstances. In the end, Ojugo's journey taught that being different is not a curse, but a gift, that true love can break the strongest chains of bitterness, and that actions, whether kind or cruel, carry consequences that echo through generations. The rejected stone had indeed become the cornerstone, proving that destiny has a way of finding its proper path, guided by the unwavering light of truth and love. And so the story lives on, whispered in orphanages, shared in homes, pondered in hearts. It serves as a reminder that in every moment lies the choice between fear and love, between rejection and acceptance, between curse and blessing. For in the end, it is not our circumstances that define us, but the choices we make and the love we choose to give or withhold.